So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our January meeting. Hopefully, you're all doing okay post snowstorm, and everybody's been able to uh, dig themselves out of the however many inches of snow everybody got. We probably got at least 15 inches my way, so it was a process cleaning out. But thank God for snow blowers. Am I right? Um, so this evening, I don't have a lot of announcements, so I'll put our shocked faces on that I don't have a lot to say this evening. But I do want to remind folks that while we're on Zoom, if everybody could just remain on mute for the duration of the presentation tonight, just helps to cut down on the background noise. If you do have questions, feel free to type those into the chat, or once Tom is done presenting, we'll be able to all come off mute and have a discussion, hopefully after too as well. But while the presentation is going on, if you could remain on mute, that would be much appreciated. Also, as you just heard, Dawn is recording the meeting this evening. We are doing that so that way, just like every other meeting, it can get posted onto our YouTube channel. So, the way that we set this up, it should not be a problem. It should only pull the video of the speaker who's been spotlighted, which is what I'm about to do to Tom's screen. But if you are worried about your face being on the internet for whatever reason, you may want to turn your video off. If you don't care, then leave your video on. Um, Only other thing I wanted to make mention of, next month's meeting will also be on Zoom. The weather speaks to why we made this choice a few years ago of moving to Zoom. I think this year we can definitely revisit that, whether or not it makes sense to continue to do that into the future. But a few years ago, when we made this choice to move our January and February meetings onto Zoom, a huge part of that was because of the weather, knowing that snowstorms and things like that do happen. Um, but, if we're going to get 9 folks, then we can always revisit that idea, right? Probably would have got more people if we were in person. So we can always revisit that idea too for next year to see if it still makes sense to do it this way. But regardless, February's meeting is the 24th, and Harold Knudsen will be speaking to us. He's a retired colonel, served in the U.S. Army. He wrote a book recently on James Longstreet. Uh, it's entitled The Confederacy's Most Modern General. So looking forward to that. So please put that on your calendars. 6 p.m., February 24th is our next monthly meeting. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening, Thomas Horrocks. Thomas A. Horrocks is an independent scholar and is currently the editor-in-chief of the Lincoln Herald, a scholarly journal published by the Lincoln Memorial University in Tennessee. He received a doctorate in history from the University of Pennsylvania and spent 30 years working as a library administrator, including positions at Harvard and Brown University. In addition to his library management career, Dr. Horrocks has taught at Harvard University Extension School and has authored, edited, and co-edited 8 books, primarily on American political history, with an emphasis on Abraham Lincoln and his time, including Lincoln's campaign biographies, published by Southern Illinois University Press in 2014, The Annotated Lincoln, Harvard University Press 2016. In 2024, the Baker Street Irregular Press published A West Wind: How America and Americans Influenced the Sherlockian Canon, which Dr. Horrocks co-edited. The book includes his chapter on Abraham Lincoln and Sherlock Holmes, a study in speculation. He is currently working on a book on Abraham Lincoln and 50 Objects, which will be published in 2027. So without further ado, Dr. Horrocks, the virtual room is yours. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate your introduction. What I'm going to talk about tonight is, you can see the title, but I'm going to zero in on Lincoln, the rail splitter. And this is, as you'll see from hear from my talk, this is a moniker that was invented for the 1860 presidential election and has continued to be used up to this day, which you may find surprising, but as you will see from my slides later in the evening, you'll understand where I'm coming from. So let me get started. Um, the Illinois Republican Party assembled on May 9th, 1860, in Decatur, Illinois, to choose its nominee for President of the United States. When Abraham Lincoln, promoted by many of the delegates as the state's choice, arrived at the convention, he was greeted enthusiastically. After order was restored, Governor Richard Oglesby announced that a Macon County Democrat requested to be allowed to make a presentation. In walked John Hanks, Lincoln's second cousin, carrying a banner on two fence rails that Hanks claimed were made by Lincoln. The banner read, "Abraham Lincoln, the rail candidate for president in 1860." Two rails from a lot of 3,000 made in 1830 by Thomas Hanks and Abraham Lincoln. The crowd went wild, recognizing the political advantage of linking their candidate to such a powerful image. Honest Abe now became Honest Abe the Rail Splitter. A week later in Chicago, Lincoln was nominated by the Republican Party for the presidency. The Republicans may have had a potent symbol for the upcoming campaign, but they also nominated a candidate who was little known outside of Illinois. A symbol, no matter how compelling, would not be enough to elect Lincoln president. Honest Abe, the rail splitter, would need to be promoted. In Lincoln's time, long before radio, film, TV, the digital age, print was the medium a candidate and his party was required to master to achieve success. In an age when presidential candidates did not engage in public campaigning, parties relied on surrogates hitting the campaign trail on behalf of the candidate. The impact of speeches and rallies were limited, however, by the number of people who witnessed them. It was the print media, newspapers, prints and photographs, pamphlets, broadsides, cartoons, sheet music, and campaign biographies that circulated speeches, disseminated images, and propagated the life story of the candidate. I will concentrate on the biographies of Lincoln, published for the 1860 campaign, and the role they played in shaping this image of the rail splitter. The campaign biography as a genre emerged during the 1824 presidential campaign waged between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. John Eaton's 1824 Life of Andrew Jackson, a reissue of his 1817 work, is considered the first presidential campaign biography. Every American presidential campaign since that contentious contest, including those of recent memory in which TV, film, the autobiography, and the internet have played an increasingly influential role, has had its share of campaign biographies. The purpose of these biographies was and still is promotional, to sell or market a candidate. Promoting presidential candidates through published biographies, as well as through other genres of print, along with parades and speeches, was especially critical in Lincoln's time because of the accepted tradition that candidates do not openly seek the office. It was considered unseemly for a candidate to campaign for himself or ask for votes. The office had to seek the man rather than the man seeking the office. That tradition, of course, was abandoned in the 20th century. But in Lincoln's time, promotion of a candidate was left to the party, partisan newspapers and their editors, to surrogates, and to commercial publishing houses seeking to profit by the public's interest in the candidates. The candidate could be and often was busy working for his election behind the scenes, sometimes assisting authors of campaign biographies. Despite the fact that it was considered inappropriate for candidates themselves to publicly campaign for votes, this did not stop the competing political parties from vigorously courting potential voters. In order to make an informed choice, American voters had at their disposal various sources of information, including several genres of print about various candidates. 19th century campaign biographies, however, provided in one place the most extensive amount of information concerning a candidate's life, character, and qualifications for the presidency. These biographies, written by experienced journalists, historians, anonymous party hacks, or in the case of Nathaniel Hawthorne and William Dean Howells, established or budding literary figures. They generally adhere to a formula when presenting candidates' lives. Of course, all authors asserted that their biographical treatment of a particular candidate was objective and free of partisanship. One must keep in mind, however, that these works were essentially propaganda pieces intended to present a candidate in the best possible light. This does not mean that biographical information was invented or inaccurate. Those oftentimes unflattering aspects or embarrassing episodes were downplayed or omitted. Rather, the purpose of these biographies was to create a positive image, one that would resonate with the American people, particularly voters. Campaign biographies, with the exception of those that were revisions of previously published works, Eaton's biography of Jackson, for example, were written in haste, in a matter of weeks, in order to be published, distributed, and hopefully influence a significant group of voters in a limited amount of time. A biography of a candidate could not be written until a party caucus or nominating convention chose a candidate for president. Moreover, the period between a convention and the election was just a matter of months. In Lincoln's case, for example, he was nominated for president on May 18, 1860, approximately 6 months before the election. Obviously, a publisher of a campaign biography wanted it available as soon as possible before the election. Thus, the author was expected to research the subject and write a biography in a matter of weeks, a much harder task if the candidate was, as was the case with Lincoln, relatively unknown. This meant that the first campaign biography of a candidate to appear was used as the chief source, parts thereof often plagiarized for subsequent biographies. The formula of campaign biographies, which ran in length from 8 to 300 pages in length at a cost of 25 cents for a paper version to $1 for a hardbound edition, remained fairly consistent throughout the 19th century. In addition to the biography and selected speeches of the presidential candidate, a short biographical sketch of the vice presidential candidate was usually offered. The recurrent message conveyed by these biographies was simple. Their subjects' lives, which served as models of inspiration and emulation, prepared them to lead the United States. The authors crafted this message by presenting a series of episodes, key periods in one's life, key influences that shaped a potential leader, and examples of leadership that told the story of a candidate. Regardless of length, all 19th century campaign biographies address their subjects' ancestry, parents, youth, early adulthood, military career, farming or business career, political career, domestic or private life, religious beliefs, and virtues. There were 16 campaign biographies issued for Abraham Lincoln in 1860, ranging from two-page newspaper articles to books of more than 300 pages in length. Most began by discussing or attempting to discuss the candidate's ancestry. One of the earliest Lincoln campaign biographies declared that the candidate has revolutionary blood in his veins, being descended from the New England Lincolns of Plymouth Colony, the most famous of whom was General Benjamin Lincoln, who served under Washington at Yorktown. While few other biographers were bold enough to make this claim, and Lincoln himself would not, some raised the probability that the candidate was related to the Massachusetts Lincolns, and by implication, to the famous general. All biographies confidently traced, as Lincoln did, the candidate's ancestral line back to Pennsylvania Quakers, who settled in Berks County and later migrated to Virginia, and in the case of Lincoln's grandfather, to Kentucky. Two biographers, unsure of Lincoln's relationship to the Plymouth Colony Lincolns and General Benjamin Lincoln in particular, asserted that he was descended from good old stock by whom the state of Pennsylvania was founded, and from people distinguished for honesty and industry. In general, Lincoln's parents received little attention in 1860 campaign biographies, since Lincoln, embarrassed about his humble beginnings, revealed little about his father, mother, and stepmother. Biographers had little to go on, except the memories of Lincoln's few relatives, as well as neighbors and friends of the Lincoln family. Both of Lincoln's parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, remarried. I skipped a page here. Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln were born in Virginia, in the words of one of the earliest biographers, under very moderate circumstances. This understatement was matched by the earliest campaign biography, which stated that Lincoln's parents were certainly not among Virginia's finest families. Another biography, on the other hand, was quite blunt and more to the point when he wrote that Lincoln's parents were poor and uneducated. Since little was known about Lincoln's mother, who died when he was only 8 years of age, little was said of her. As for Lincoln's father, he was presented as a victim of circumstance, having lost his own father, Abraham, to an Indian attack a year or two after moving to Kentucky from Virginia. Thomas Lincoln became, in the words of William Dean Howells, a wandering homeless boy who grew up without education. After losing his wife in 1818, Thomas Lincoln remarried a year later. Sarah Bush Johnston of Kentucky, a widow with 3 children, became Abraham Lincoln's stepmother. Lincoln may have been self-conscious when it came to the lowly status of his parents, especially his father, but campaign biographers were not. In fact, his parents' lack of education and humble circumstances were part of a larger story that biographers were more than happy to relate. Lincoln's youth in a primitive frontier environment was a time of struggle, heartbreak, and meager subsistence. Every biographer presented Lincoln's youth against the backdrop of a rude, harsh, and wild backwoods life of Kentucky and Indiana, where he spent his pre-adult years. Barely making ends meet, the Lincoln family moved from one rustic log cabin to another, sometimes with 7 or 8 living in one room and a loft. Not only was life hard, but for Lincoln, it was accompanied by emotional loss as he endured the deaths of his mother, younger brother, and older sister. Lincoln's campaign biographers readily admitted that his frontier experience was not unusual. What was uncommon, however, was how Lincoln, through hard work, ambition, discipline, persistence, and an innate intelligence, overcame seemingly insurmountable odds to achieve a level of success that few could claim. Most biographers emphasize Lincoln's severe lack of formal education. Lincoln himself referred to his education as defective, which comprised less than a year. Yet Lincoln, making good use of his limited schooling and following a personal regimen of self-education, learned to read and write. Joseph H. Barrett, echoing several other biographers, wrote that the young Lincoln read with avidity such instructive works as he could obtain, and in winter evenings, by the mere light of a blazing fireplace, when no better resource was at hand. His regimen of self-improvement, primarily through reading, continued into his 20s, when he mastered grammar, mathematics, law, and surveying. As Lincoln strove mightily to cultivate his mind, he was at the same time developing a strong character and a deep appreciation of ordinary Americans, rejoicing in their simple joys and pleasures, and uniting with them all by that band of brotherhood among the honest poor, a common heritage of labor. Lincoln, as a representative of the working man, is a theme encountered often in campaign biographies. His ardent belief in the dignity of labor was formed amidst the roughest hardships and the most trying experiences of frontier life. After all, Lincoln was, according to biographer John Locke Scripps, constantly engaged in the various kinds of labor incident to the country and the times, felling the forest, clearing the ground of the undergrowth and of logs, splitting rails, pulling the crosscut and the whipsaw, driving the frontier, plowing, houring, planting, hoeing, harvesting, assisting at house raising, log rollings, corn huskings, and mingling cordially with the simple-minded, honest people with whom his lot was cast. Because Lincoln was brought up to the habits of sobriety and accustomed to steady labor, wrote another biographer, no one of all the working men with whom he came in contact with was a better sample of his class than he. Two aspects of Lincoln's young adulthood that all biographers highlighted were his prowess with an axe and his popularity. The former, of course, was tied into the rail splitter theme of the campaign. As William Dean Howes wrote, until he was 23, the axe was seldom out of Lincoln's hand, except in the interval of labor or when it was exchanged for the plow, the hoe, and the sickle. Several writers noted the fact that when Lincoln moved with his family to Illinois in 1830, he and fellow laborers split 3,000 rails. In terms of Lincoln's popularity with his peers, many biographers cited the legendary wrestling match between Lincoln and Jack Armstrong, the leader of the so-called Clary Grove Boys, and his election as captain of his volunteer company in the Black Hawk War of 1832. Unlike many presidential candidates, such as Jackson, William Henry Harrison, and Winfield Scott, that preceded him, Lincoln had scant military experience to promote. All biographers emphasized Lincoln's patriotic response to the call for volunteers for the Black Hawk War, and the fact that when the men of his company chose a man to serve as captain, they overwhelmingly chose Lincoln. In addition, when Lincoln's company was disbanded, he re-volunteered and served as a private. Despite the fact that Lincoln did not engage in any combat, he was applauded for his service. As one biographer stated, Lincoln served gallantly. Another opined that Lincoln proved himself every inch a soldier. He observed the daily routine, which approved himself a man and endured him to his comrades. Lincoln's relationship to the soil was confined to his youth and young adulthood. In fact, Lincoln disliked farm work and had no intention of pursuing an agricultural career. Thus, unable to tie Lincoln to the noble pursuit of farming, his biographers instead concentrated on his various jobs as a flatboatsman, store clerk, and store owner, a surveyor, a postmaster, and lawyer. Readers learned that his flatboat experience consisted of exposure, of hard labor, and constant peril, which proved Lincoln's strength and courage. The debts Lincoln incurred as a co-owner of a failed store were repaid, reinforcing his reputation for honesty. And his mastery of and success at surveying and the law were the result of a disciplined regimen of self-education. In short, Lincoln was a self-made man. Despite Lincoln's success as a lawyer and the integral role it played in his life, his legal career receives minimal coverage. This is perhaps due to the 19th century Americans' distrust of the legal profession. Nevertheless, Lincoln's rapid rise in the profession was noted, with one biographer stating that Lincoln obtained a reputation at the bar which placed him in the front rank of the many able and profound jurists in Illinois. Another wrote that when practicing the law, Lincoln was never known to undertake a cause which he believed founded in wrong and injustice. By the testimony of all, in the memory of everyone who had known him, he continued, Lincoln is a pure, candid, and upright man, unblemished by the vices which so often disfigure greatness, utterly incapable of falsehood, and without one base or sordid trait. Several biographers cited the famous Almanac case as an example of Lincoln's integrity, kindness, and willingness to fight the good fight and for the poor client, as opposed to other lawyers who are more concerned about lining their pockets. Lincoln, of course, spent much of his time away from the courtroom in the political arena, and by far this aspect of his life received the most attention in his campaign biographies. All of them covered in detail Lincoln's 4 terms as a state legislator, his 1 term in Congress, and his famous debates with Stephen Douglas during the 1858 U.S. Senate race in Illinois. When discussing Lincoln's state assembly and congressional career, all biographers described Lincoln as a Henry Clay Whig, a strong advocate of the American system of internal improvements, a protective tariff, opposition to the Mexican War, though all biographies stressed his support for the troops, an ardent supporter of the Wilmot Proviso, a zealous advocate of free labor in the territories, and as a man of moderate to conservative views on slavery, morally opposed to the institution and its extension into the territories and the District of Columbia, but opposed to abolitionism. Lincoln was touted as one of the leading Whigs in the West. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, Lincoln became a leader of the anti-Nebraska forces and one of the founders of the Illinois Republican Party that grew out of the anti-Nebraska movement. He is portrayed in biographies as Senator Stephen Douglas's equal in debating and superior in cause. All pointed out that the majority of people in Illinois agreed. Lincoln won the popular vote, but lost the election in the legislature due to fraudulent districting by the Democrats. It is Lincoln's performance in the debates, his eloquence on the stump, his reputation for honesty and integrity, his long-standing support of working men, and his courage to fight for the right no matter the political cost that explain his nomination as the Republican candidate for president. Very little space was devoted to the candidate's private or domestic life in campaign biographies prior to the Civil War. This was certainly the case with Lincoln's biographies. The candidate was portrayed as an honest, moral, temperate, and as a loving family man with plain and simple tastes. Lincoln, according to one biographer, is a strictly moral and temperate man. Another hailed Lincoln's abstemious habits and his modest means and simple tastes. According to John Quay Howard, Lincoln's habits are the most abstemious. His food is plain, and his drink is usually cold water. He is a man of purest morals. He never drank a drop of liquor, never used tobacco, and was never guilty of a licentious act. He never uses profane languages, conveniently omitting Lincoln's well-known reputation for telling smutty stories and jokes, and never gambles. He never wronged any man out of a cent. Little was said about Mary Todd Lincoln, but what was conveyed was very favorable, especially in light of the searing criticism she endured during the White House years. In campaign biography, she is presented as a woman of charming presence, of superior intelligence, of accomplished manners, and in every respect, well fitted to advance the position of First Lady. The Lincoln children were given a mere passing reference. Mention was made of the death of Lincoln's second son, Eddie, in 1842. As for the surviving three sons, they, according to one biographer, had been well trained and their education very particularly cared for. Several referred to the fact that the oldest son, Robert, was about to enter Harvard. Finally, the Lincolns' Springfield, Illinois residence, a comfortable two-story frame house, was applauded for its simple and quiet style. After all, a plain and unassuming house was an appropriate abode for a man of the people. Fortunately for Lincoln, 19th century campaign biographies paid scant attention to the candidate's religion. Several Lincoln biographers ignored completely the candidate's religion, an area in which he was open to criticism, while others offered a brief, albeit positive, assessment. John Locke Scripps, for example, claimed there are few men in public life so familiar with the scripture as Mr. Lincoln. Another biography asserted that Lincoln has, by his means and influence, always been a supporter of Christianity. Finally, Joseph Hartwell Barrett declared that Mrs. Lincoln is a Presbyterian, and her husband, though not a member, is a liberal supporter of the church to which she belongs. The image of Lincoln that emerges from these campaign biographies is that of a man who overcame the humble, primitive environment into which he was born, and who, despite being raised by illiterate parents and suffering the emotional traumas associated with frontier life, became an honest, moral, pious, popular leader of men as a result of hard, rugged work, clean living, strength of will, a vibrant intellect, and a tenacious regimen of self improvement. Lincoln was the ideal self made man, but he was also something much more. He was Honest Abe, the rail splitter. To Lincoln's biographers, these nicknames symbolize something much deeper than honesty and the ability to wield an axe. However, many biographers advance the argument that this backwoods man embodied all the virtuous components that made up the American character. This good citizen and honest patriot not only sprung directly from the people, wrote one biographer, but still belongs to the people, who is one of them and among them. In his history and in his character, Lincoln is the true offspring of democracy. Another biographer asserted that Lincoln stands today not only a representative of the early Western stock, the hunter, the farmer, and pioneer, but an admirable example of what energy and ability can do for a man honestly using them in honorable pursuits. Lincoln, wrote John Locke Scripps, presents in his own person the best living illustration of the true dignity of labor and of the genius of our free American institutions. Barrett also linked Lincoln's destiny with the common laborer, stating that the unassuming and self-taught Illinois lawyer is a man of sterling integrity and incorruptible honesty, a suitable agent for rescuing the federal government from its present degradations. Biographer Reuben Vose argued that Lincoln was the right man for the time. After all, Vose claimed, our first and principal task as a nation has been to subdue the vast wilderness which has been given us as a heritage. This has been our destiny, and the pioneers of the West have been instruments of this success. Thus, in Lincoln, Americans behold one of the most hardy and adventurous of these backwoodsmen. His life, declared Vose, has typified one grand and characteristic mission of our people and become a representative man in the truest sense of the word. This honest rail splitter's life, William Dean Howells noted, represented all that is admirable about the American nation and offered Americans a model worth emulating. And I'll end this address with a quote from Howells. The purity of his reputation, the greatness and dignity of his ambition enable every incident of his career and give significance to all the events of his past. It is true that simply to have mauled rails and commanded a flatboat is not to have performed splendid actions. But the fact that Lincoln has done these things and has risen above them by his own force confers a dignity upon them. And the rustic boy who is to be president in 1900 may well be consoled and encouraged by his labors. So let me now go through the slides, and some of which will be of campaign biographies. This is the first campaign biography published in New York in 1860, June of 1860. Probably written by George Carleton, but his name no longer appears on the title page. And I want to point out on the frontispiece is a portrait of Lincoln. Now remember, this was a time before TV and illustrations in newspapers. So if you didn't see Lincoln in person, many voters would not have known what Lincoln looked like. They had a chance to see what Lincoln looked like, at least through engravings and woodcuts, through these campaign biographies. So you'll see here is an image of Lincoln, and you'll see others in this is another campaign biography. This is by Bartlett, David W. Bartlett. This was published in June, also in June of 1860. The Life and Public Services of Abraham Lincoln. And you will see on the paper cover is another image of Lincoln. And again, this is how people knew what Lincoln looked like. This biography was published in June, again in 1860. You see, they're all coming out as quickly as possible. Lincoln is nominated in May, and they're coming out within a month of his nomination. This was published by a radical Republican Boston firm of Thayer and Eldridge, and includes a brief biography of vice presidential candidate Hannibal Hamlin. Again, you see a different image of Lincoln with a copy of his handwriting. This biography was written by up-and-coming author William Dean Howells, published in Columbus, Ohio on late June, written quickly, based primarily on previously published bios, like the preceding bios I've just showed you. Howells didn't want to travel to Springfield, Illinois to do research, so he sent a young student by the name of John Q. Howard, who later wrote his own biography, sent him to Springfield, whose research he ended up not using. He basically used the previous campaign biographies. And again, you see an engraving of Lincoln, which is a different view of Lincoln. This is John Hartwell Barrett's biography of Lincoln, first issued in paper in late June, and a hardcover version in early July. Barrett was the editor of the Cincinnati Daily Gazette and a delegate to the 1860 Republican Convention. He gathered info for this book, again, from previous biographies and from Lincoln himself during at least 2 visits to Springfield. Lincoln later appointed Barrett to be Commissioner of Pensions. Barrett also wrote an 1864 campaign biography of Lincoln. The final campaign biography I will show is by John Quay Howard, the person that William Dean Howells sent to Springfield to do research for him that he never used. Well, the research that Howard uncovered, he used for his own campaign biography. And so as a result, Howard wrote his own biography, which came out later than the other biographies which I've showed you. And whether or not it was read that much, we don't know. Now, there were also campaign newspapers that were published by the various campaigns during the period between the nominating convention and the election, usually published every week. There were 2 Lincoln campaign newspapers called the Rail Splitter. One was published in Chicago, Illinois. You see the masthead here. The other was published in Cincinnati, Ohio. Same name. And as you see, there is the image of Lincoln splitting rails. Cartoons in newspapers also played up the rail splitter theme. Here is Lincoln, the last rail split by Honest Old Abe. And you will see that the writing on the rail is the Democratic Party. Thus, Lincoln is splitting the Democrats by using a maul to hammer in the what do you call that? I can't remember what you call that. Anyway, which splits the rail. Again, this is another cartoon, and this is showing Lincoln with an axe, uh, showing Stephen A. Douglas, who was the running for the Northern Democratic Party. We talked about the split in the Democratic Party. There was a southern wing of the Democratic Party who ran their own candidate because they felt that Douglas wasn't um, supportive enough of Southern interests. So this is Douglas, who's dressed as a fop. Lincoln is dressed more in formal clothing, but Lincoln is giving advice to Stephen A. Douglas. This is a poem, Rail Lyrics, The Power of the Rail or the Fall of J.B., James Buchanan, who was the president before Lincoln. And you see where Lincoln is knocking over his chair by balancing the rail, split rail, on the rock of the Constitution. Again, a cartoon showing Lincoln made of split rails. So you can see that the rail splitter theme really took off in terms of popularity, played up by Republican leaning newspapers and magazines. Postal covers. This is one of many postal covers which were issued during the campaign. Again, you see the split rail fence along the top and the side. There were other postal covers showing Lincoln splitting rails. You can't see, I'm not sure if you can see this whole image, but this is a small item that was used in the campaign, carried in parades of a axe, promoting Lincoln as the rail splitter, 1860. And this is a pin in the shape of an axe, and you can see the rail splitter on the blade and Honest Abe on the handle. This is an engraving showing the Wide Awakes, which was sort of a semi-militaristic group of Lincoln supporters who marched at night and dressed in military garb and carried signs. And one of the items that is being carried by one of the Wide Awakes is a rail splitter, is a axe. Tokens and medals were produced for the campaign. And here on the verso of a campaign token is an image of Lincoln, the rail splitter of the West. And again, you see this image showing up over and over again. This is a work of art. It's an 1860 oil painting showing Lincoln splitting rails by an unknown author. Notice the picture of the White House in the distance. This is an early 20th century print of Lincoln splitting rails. So we're now getting away from the campaign, but the rail splitter image continues on even after Lincoln's death. And it's an image that, unlike Lincoln, the great emancipator, which was contested by several groups, first Southerners, then later by Black historians and the Black community. The rail splitter image has never really been contested. Both pro and anti-Lincoln camps can agree that, yeah, sure, he was a rail splitter. This was a late 19th century lithograph showing Lincoln walking while reading a book and carrying an axe over his shoulder. This is a 20th century postcard showing Lincoln splitting rails. And there are a number of these kinds of postcards showing different versions of Lincoln as a rail splitter. Another postcard to give you an example. This is a relatively recent coin commemorating Lincoln's years in Indiana, showing him sitting on a log that he is in the process of splitting, also reading a book. This is a print based on a famous painting by Norman Rockwell entitled The Rail Splitter. And again, you see Lincoln reading a book and carrying an axe. This is a statue of Lincoln in Illinois, statue of Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter by sculptor Charles Mulligan, created in 1905 and installed in Garfield Park in Chicago to commemorate the 1909 centennial of Lincoln's birth. This is a 30-foot statue of Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, created by a local artist, Carl Reines, in 1968. And it is a great tourist attraction. A lot of people taking photographs if they're going through Springfield and they see this 30-foot statue. This is a stamp commemorating the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth in 2009, showing a young Lincoln splitting rails. And finally, this is a poster for the 2012 film Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. In the movie, Lincoln slays vampires using what else? An axe. And that is the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. If folks have any questions, if they'd like to type them in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, feel free to do so at this time.
I must have put everybody to sleep.
Not at all. Not at all. Oh, we got one question in the chat, so we'll start there. Were the campaign biographies targeted for swing states, similar to the way TV advertisements are generally only shown in contested areas?
That's a good question. Little is really known about how these campaign biographies, where they were distributed. There were swing states, Illinois actually being one of them, Lincoln's own state of Illinois. Pennsylvania was a swing state. So was Indiana. Um, my answer, and this is speculation, my answer is no, that they were not targeted specifically to swing states. They were sold and you could buy them, but they were also given out free at rallies. So wherever there was a rally, a parade, a speech in support of Lincoln, the party would make sure that there were campaign biographies to be distributed, and many of them distributed for free. So whether they geared them to swing states, it's unknown. And I really can't answer that specifically, but I would tend to think not. But on the other hand, campaigns tried to steer more money to swing states, and it would make sense to steer campaign biographies in that direction. I hope that answered your question, or I tried to answer your question.
I won't speak for the person, but I think that did. That was a very good answer. Other questions?
Yeah, Tom, that was my question, and that does give a pretty good answer for me. Not knowing if there were the polling practices that were in place today back in those days, but there were. I know you mentioned Illinois. I think New Jersey was a contested state as well, and also the border states, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Maybe there were more rallies held at that point. A second question that I would have is that were these reissued again in 1864?
Very few of them were. I mentioned Barrett, and Barrett's biography was reissued, and it reissued with uh, additional information. You must remember that when he ran in 1860, he really didn't have much of a record to run on. And they concentrated a lot on the image of Lincoln as the rail splitter, man of the people, uh, self made man. When he ran in 1864, of course, he had been president for almost 4 years. And so you had his whole administration that had to be defended in the biography. And while the information about his humble beginnings and being a rail splitter and all were part of the 1864 campaign biographies, they were not the main message. The main message was he's been leading us through the war. He's been a good commander in chief. He has been a father to the troops. Father Abraham, in a sense, became the new moniker that sort of replaced the rail splitter, at least for the 1864 campaign. The rail splitter never went away, as I've shown. In fact, today it's still out there, Lincoln the rail splitter, whereas Father Abraham has sort of gone by the wayside now that the war's over. And but that was the image they tried to promote in 1864, and there were fewer campaign biographies, 16 in 1860, and there were only about 5 or 6 or 7 in 1864, and many of them were written by different people who didn't write biographies in 1860.
I have two questions actually. First of all, are you familiar with any songs that took up the theme of the rail splitter as campaign songs? I'm wondering, particularly by the Hutchinson family singers, perhaps.
There was sheet music, and there were uh, published during the 60 campaign a lot of sheet music, and there were also songsters, which were books that included various songs. Uh, Many times the lyrics were adapted to a song that's been a tune that's familiar. For example, the tune of Yankee Doodle Dandy might have different lyrics
Right, that was
promoting
typical.
Lincoln, promoting Lincoln. And yes, there were uh, sheet music. There was sheet music that had the theme of the rail splitter. If it didn't have the rail splitter mentioned in the lyrics, the cover of the sheet music would have split rails around the side or showing Lincoln with an axe. And the same with songsters. There would be songs that would have the rail splitter theme. And I should have shown that actually in my slides. I didn't have a slide of the example of sheet music, but that's a very good question. That's just another genre of print that was used by all campaigns
Yes,
in many campaigns.
right. Second question, going back to something you mentioned very early in your talk, that one of the first, or perhaps the first campaign biography was of Andrew Jackson in the 1824 election. What effect do you think that had? Because I mean, as you know, that was split amongst five different candidates, and Jackson got the most electoral college votes, but not enough to win the election. Um, uh, do you? I mean, John Quincy Adams, of course, was chosen by the Congress, and I'm assuming he did not produce a biography at that time. But
I'm trying to remember. I think there was one or two campaign biographies for John Quincy Adams. There
okay,
were many for Andrew Jackson, and virtually every one of them concentrated on Jackson as a military hero,
right,
and as Eaton's did. After all, Eaton's biography originally came out soon after Jackson's great victory in New Orleans, but it they later came out. It was reissued for the 1824 campaign. But again, what role did it play? I would think it played a role. How what the role is? It's hard to say. We really don't have good figures on how successful these campaign biographies were. I mean, how did they sell? We know that there were a couple Lincoln campaign biographies that there were claims that they sold 20,000 copies. How does one prove that? I don't know, because there just weren't the publication figures available like there is today. They certainly wouldn't have hurt a campaign or a candidate. And I suspect that they reinforced many Americans' views of Jackson as a military hero. And John Quincy Adams did not have that aspect on his behalf, though he was the son of, John Adams, one of the founders. So that played in John Quincy Adams's favor. But you're right, because there were so many candidates, it was thrown into the House of Representatives. And, there was Jackson claimed, as you know, a deal was made between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay to throw the election for Clay. Whether or not that's true, we'll never know. I think there was a comment or another question.
There is, yeah. So Tim asked, were you able to review any campaign biographies of the other candidates, so Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell?
Yes, I was not as closely as Lincoln. Quite frankly, my original plan was to write a history of the campaign biography as a genre. And I decided, it had been done back in 1960, years ago. And I thought it would be nice to update it, but I decided not to. So I did look at Douglas's campaign biographies as well as Breckinridge's and John Bell's. There weren't many of John Bell, weren't many of Breckinridge or Douglas. In fact, Lincoln's 16 campaign biographies were as many as Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell combined. And all of the biographies of Breckinridge, Douglas, and Lincoln addressed the same themes as did Lincoln's in terms of ancestry, family, profession, their background, their religion, their so on and so forth, their career. Unlike Lincoln, of course, they didn't have that catchy rail splitter, honest Abe rail splitter theme that Lincoln had.
Joe also had a question, which I think was a good one, and it's a good way to start to wrap things up. He said, "Excellent presentation. When are tours available of your office? That's a fascinating collection." A
I
few
get,
years ago, when we were all in COVID, I remember there was a whole thing with like rate the background of the speaker, and you may win, Tom. That may be the most impressive background I think I've ever seen.
and that's only part of it. Um, well, thank you. Tours are only $10 a piece. Only kidding. Only kidding. If you're ever in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you can, if you want to let me know, I'll be glad to show it to you. It looks more impressive than it is. Let's put it that way. There's nothing of great value here. In other words, I don't have any Lincoln letters. I just, I've never made enough money to be able to, afford $100,000 letters, $20,000 letters. I do have some valuable statues and prints, contemporary prints, and I have a number of campaign biographies of a number of presidents, certainly up to 1900. And I have some Lincoln relics, so-called relics, whether or not they're actually authentic. Um, it's hard to determine. But as you can see, I do have some statues, a lot of framed items, a lot of statues, a lot of busts and books and prints and you name it. I collect on a low level. So
perhaps to fundraise to actually buy a Lincoln letter someday, though. If folks are interested in buying one of your books, what is the best way that they would go about that?
Um, well, my Lincoln campaign biographies is published by Southern Illinois University Press, both in hardback and paperback. But I would think the best way is probably just go on Amazon.com and type in my name, and you'll see all the books that I've published, and you'll probably get a better discount there than you will from one of the publishers of my books.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you so very much for joining us this evening.
My
As
pleasure, Mark.
a token of our appreciation, I don't know how this will come up here, but we
Oh
have
yeah, okay.
Bedford Civil War Roundtable mug that we give to all of our speakers as a thank you for your time and efforts. So I will reach out to you on a separate channel for a good mailing address, and we'll make sure we get you your mug, and you can maybe add it to the collection back there with all of the Lincoln ephemera.
Thank you very much, and it was a real pleasure to speak to the group.
Mark,
Uh,
Mark,
Yes.
excuse me. I just let me make one quick comment.
Yeah.
In a world that needs an example of what leadership really is, I think in a very short time, you draw a picture of Lincoln that people need to know. That's how leadership grows, and we are capable of leadership in some human beings, and it's a great example of the package you put together. It's really, really well done. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Very nice.
Dave.
Well,
Well, folks, hope you'll be able to join us next month. Again, Tuesday, February 24th. We'll be joined by Harold Knudsen, retired colonel, who will be speaking about General James Longstreet, the Confederacy's most modern general. So we hope to see you then. Be on the lookout for the Zoom link. It should come from the New Bedford CWRT@gmail.com. So that's the roundtable's email. It should come from that email. So we hope to see you all then. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you again, Tom, very much for your time.
Thank you all.